We're living in a world that is absolutely filled with unrest. When you look at your nightly news, or you look at the newspaper, or you look at a news magazine, and you see the strife and the unrest that is going on all around the world. You can look at what's happening in Europe. You can look at what's happening down in the Balkans. Did you notice that just a matter of days ago, there were marches in Russia in celebration of Hitler's birthday? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Just a matter of a very short time ago that there could have ever been such a thing. Imagine. There's no country that suffered more in World War II than did Russia. In terms of loss of life, in terms of destruction, nobody suffered more at the hands of Hitler's armies than did Russia. Literally millions upon millions of people who died there in Russia. And you had long, drawn-out events like the siege of Stalingrad and the attempt to conquer Eastern Russia or Western Russia, to conquer Moscow. Tremendous events that occurred, horrible circumstances, and yet things have come so far that just a matter of a few days ago, there were those who were marching in support and celebration of the birthday of Adolf Hitler. The largest party in the Russian parliament is headed by a man who is very clearly sympathetic to fascist and Nazi aims. He has been in contact with these sort of groups in Germany and in the rest of Europe. Oh, I know that he's dismissed as a buffoon and as a clown and as a nut by much of the Western leadership. But you have to understand, so was Adolf Hitler. Just a matter of a short time before he took over power in Germany. I'm not saying that Zhirinovsky is going to be the man to take over Russia, but I think what we need to understand as we look at the situation in Europe is that there is very severe unrest. There is unease. Not only do you have warfare flaring in the Balkans, which has always been the powder keg of Europe, that was where World War I began. Europe is very much aware. This is, of course, one of the major things that holds them back from intervening down in the Balkans. Because as you look at the Balkans, what you have to realize is that ones that are fighting there are three major groups down there. And they have historically been allied with three major centers of power. And each center of power knows that's what brought them into World War I, because when they intervened in behalf of their allies down there, it brought them into conflict with one another. The Serbs have historically been in alliance and in league with the Orthodox Slavic realm. The Russians have historically, for centuries, been the protectors of the Serbs. The Croats have been allied with the Germans and the Catholic Western Europe, and the Muslims there in Bosnia have had their alliance with the Turks and the Arabs and the Muslim world. And so you have three major centers that converge in that area of Europe. You've got the Muslim South, you've got the Orthodox Slavic East, and the Germanic Catholic West. And none of those groups want to find themselves brought into major conflict there over the situation in the Balkans involving people who have been in conflict for centuries. It is a very volatile circumstance, and it's got people deeply concerned as to what intervention would mean, concerned as to who would be dragged into the conflict if there is an intervention. And one of the things that compounds it is the fact that Europe is right now in the midst of an economic recession. For a long time, Germany was the economic engine that pulled the rest of Europe, Western Europe, in terms of economic power and recovery. But the German economic engine has been greatly slowed down. The absorption of what had been East Germany has proved to be a very big bite to swallow, difficult to digest. And the whole German economy has been affected, and with it, the economy of all of Western Europe. People want freedom, but you know what they want even more than freedom? Well, they want safety. They want security. People want freedom until there are riots in the streets and the whole place is falling apart and they're afraid. And when they get scared enough, they want a strong man who will bring order out of chaos. Europe is increasingly on the verge of these sorts of things. You can look not only in Europe, you can look at events going on in Africa and see the absolute bloodbath that has been occurring in the southern part of Africa and Rwanda. You can look on down in South Africa and see all of the strife and the troubles that are happening there. And these things are talked about right in the pages of our Bible. We're told in Matthew 24 by what Jesus Christ said that He talked about nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom. You know, nation against nation, the word that's translated nation in the Greek language there in Matthew 24 is the word ethnos. It's the word we get our word ethnic from. Even the word nation goes back to the same root meaning. It's the same word we get our word native or nativity. You know, you talk about a nativity scene that people put up around Christmas time. Or we talk about someone being a native of wherever. You know, he's a native of Crowley, or he's a native of Louisiana, or a native of Mississippi. What do we mean by that? We mean that's where he was born. Native, nation, all of that has to do with people who are connected by birth. Ethnos, or ethnic, means people of the same ethnic group. People who are of the same basic origin. Kingdom, on the other hand, refers to a political entity. Refers to what we think of today. We often use the word nation to refer to a country, to a political state that may include many different ethnic groups. As over the years, historically, many kingdoms and empires have. So Christ talked about two different things. He said there's going to be war, major war, involving political nation states, involving kingdoms and alliances of kingdoms. There's going to be war in that way, and there's also going to be ethnic strife. Nationalism, as we term it. Basically unleashed in the aftermath of the French Revolution, gaining steam during the 19th century and erupting full-blown in the 20th century. It has been the bane of the 20th century from the beginning all the way till now, is the rampant nationalism. Ethnos against ethnos. That's what's happening in South Africa. That's at the root of the problems. The Xoshas and the Zulus, who've hated one another for over 150 years, ever since they both invaded from up further north in Africa and came into conflict down there as they were coming into what we today term South Africa, coming into it from different directions. Then they encountered the Boers, the descendants of the Dutch, early Dutch immigrants, and then there's animosity on top of that with the English. And so you've got strife, ethnos against ethnos, varying splits and schisms down there. Same thing, you look at Rwanda and Burundi and that area up a little bit further in Africa. What's the strife? What are they fighting over? Well, it's not so much what are they fighting over as they're fighting over the fact that Hutus and Tutsis don't like one another. And they have had trouble. And one has tried to dominate the other and make slaves of the other for centuries. Now they're going at it, and there are tens of thousands that are dead. What about when you get into the Balkans? The Serbs and the Croats and the Bosnians? You line them all up in a row, and you and I may not even know which one is which. But they know. They're historic animosities. What had been a political state has been torn apart, ripped asunder. We're seeing these things all over the world. We live in a very unstable world. A very unstable world. You can look at the Middle East. You can look place after place. As we look at world events and we look at what's going on the world scene, we need to understand that this book, the Bible, has a great deal to say about the world in which we currently live, the world in which we currently find ourselves. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of this book, depending on how you count, is prophecy. And that, by any definition, is a very large segment. A very large section of this book, the Bible, is prophecy. And it's important that we understand some things in that regard, and some things on which I want to turn our attention this afternoon. Let's go back to begin with to the book of Isaiah. One of the major things about prophecy is that prophecy is a proof that there is a real God. Prophecy demonstrates that there is a real God who rules in the affairs of men. In Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 21, Isaiah quotes God. "Produce your cause, says the Eternal. Bring forth your strong reason, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them forth and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things, what they be, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare us things for to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Yes, do good or evil, that we may be dismayed and behold it together." So God says, here, in a sense, addressing the idols, let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Tell the future. So we come on down in Isaiah 42, verse 8. "I am the Eternal, that is my name, and my glory will I not give to another, neither my praise to graven images." Speaking here of the idols the people were worshiping. "Behold, the former things are come to pass, and new things do I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them." So God, the real God, the true God, was able to declare new things before they happened. Able to read tomorrow's headlines today. Now, when you look at the news, you're reading what happened yesterday. When you read the Bible, you're reading what's going to happen tomorrow. Notice in Isaiah 46, verse 9. "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God, there's none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning. And from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, I will do all my pleasure." God says, I declare the end from the beginning. God has a great master plan that He is working out. And He declares in this book the end from the very beginning. Prophecy is a major proof that God exists. And you can prove that God exists. God says, "Prove me now herewith." God tells us to prove all things. So it is a matter that we can prove that God exists, and we should know that. And one of the major proofs is the fulfillment of prophecy. And not just some obscure little thing done off in a corner somewhere. Not some just vague matter that you can take any number of ways. Now, prophecy serves to point out that there is a real God. A real God that is working out a plan and a purpose in human life. A real God that is working out a plan and a purpose here on this earth. Prophecy contains warning and encouragement. Back in Psalm 37. Psalm 37 and verse 22. "Such as be blessed of him shall inherit the earth. They that be cursed of him shall be cut off." That's a pretty succinct statement. Those that are blessed are going to inherit the earth. Didn't say anything about them going to heaven, you notice. Those that are blessed are going to inherit the earth, and those that are cursed will be cut off. It didn't say they're going to burn forever in hellfire. It says they're going to be cut off. They're going to be destroyed. In fact, it says right on down here, let's notice in verse 18, "The Lord knows the days of the upright, and their inheritance shall be forever." Verse 20, "The wicked shall perish. The enemies of the Eternal shall be as the fat of lambs. They shall consume." You ever notice what you ever grilled and had some fat on the meat? You know what happens? Next thing you do, if you're not keeping a good eye on it, boy, you got flames shooting up. That fat has begun to melt and drip down, and it has caught on fire. And you know what will happen? It'll burn up. You don't put it out if you don't quench it. You don't remove it from the fire, it'll burn up. Now that's what's going to happen to the wicked. They're going to be as the fat of lambs. They shall consume, into smoke shall they consume away. So that's what's going to happen to the wicked. They're going to burn up, just like, fat on a piece of meat that you're roasting over a barbecue pit. But those who are blessed of the Lord will inherit the earth. Their inheritance, we're told in verse 18, will be forever. So God talks about that there are consequences, there are events that are going to come to pass. They're going to result in God's justice. God is a God of judgment as well as a God of mercy. The essence, you can't really have one. One loses value without the other. God showed mercy to all without regard to repentance. Then what's the point of trying to serve Him? What's the point of repentance? Oh, God is a God of judgment as well as a God of great mercy. And there are consequences. God is working out a plan and a purpose. And that plan and purpose is laid out right here in the pages of our Bible. In Matthew 24, which is the focal point of Bible prophecy, in Matthew 24, in verse 1, we read that Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came to Him for to show Him the buildings of the temple. They were really impressed. This was one of the most impressive buildings anywhere around. And Jesus said unto them, as they were admiring this temple that Herod had been building, and there had been an ongoing construction there for over 40 years, Jesus said unto them, you see all these things? Truly I say to you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Well, you can just imagine how they must have looked at one another and thought, what? My. Oh, you know what he's talking about? Oh, I don't know what he's talking about. You can just see them, as they sort of walk along, sort of looking at one another and trying to figure out. And so they got on up a little further, and as they sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto Him privately. They got Him off from the crowd, where they felt that He would speak clearly, not in parables. They got Him off privately, and they said, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The word world here is the Greek word aeon. It means age. It doesn't mean this physical globe. What's going to be the sign of your coming? What's going to be the sign of the end of this age? Now, did Jesus say, why? You don't need to be worrying about those things. Why? Things are just going to go on, and what you need to be doing is trying to make this world a better place. Maybe, everybody everywhere will start loving one another, and that's what He said, right? Did He say that you shouldn't be speculating about prophecy? That's not good, let's not talk about things like that. No, He didn't say that either. The first thing He said was, take heed that no man deceive you. Now, who's He talking about? Is He talking about the Hindus and the Buddhists and the Muslims? Is He talking about the atheists? Is that who He was worried was going to come along and deceive His people? No. He says, many shall come in my name. Oh, they weren't going to come in Buddha's name. They weren't going to come in Mohammed's name. He wasn't talking about people who were coming in the name of this or that, some other religion. He said, many shall come in my name, saying that I'm the Christ, and shall deceive many. Now, how can you deceive people if you acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah? Isn't all you have to do just believe? If you believe in Christ, that makes you a Christian, right? So you can't deceive anybody if you believe in Christ. If you talk about Jesus, you can't deceive anybody, right? Oh, well, that's not so. All you got to do is turn back to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew 7:21. Not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Oh, there's more to it than just saying Jesus is the Lord. Not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. No, you've got to do something. You've got to obey God. Evidently, Jesus was under the impression that the Father was somewhere, and that somewhere was heaven. And He was here on the earth, and He was talking about His Father up in heaven. And He says, you need to do the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and in your name have cast out demons, and in your name done many wonderful works? We've used your name. We've done all kinds of things. And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. You that practice lawlessness. You that disregard and trample underfoot the law of God. So when someone can come, when Christ said, many will come in my name, He said, take heed that no man deceive you. He's talking here to His disciples. Now, were the disciples going to be deceived by somebody coming and talking about Mohammed or Buddha? Oh, absolutely not. That's not the primary thing that was going to deceive the disciples of Christ. It was people who were coming using the name of Christ, but not teaching His message. Long, long ago, a very short time after these words were spoken, there were those who came with another gospel. Now, you can read about it. It talks about it in Galatians, talks about it in 1 Corinthians, talks about it in Thessalonians, talks about it. Another gospel. It was a gospel about the person of Christ substituted for the gospel that was the message He brought. So the first thing Christ warned His disciples about was being deceived of those who would come appropriating His name and yet not teaching His message. And then He said, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled. These things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilence, or disease epidemics, and earthquakes in different places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you'll be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. False prophets will rise and deceive many. Iniquity will abound. Lawlessness. Love will become cold. He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. To endure is to remain faithful to God. To remain faithful to God's truth. Through all types of allure and enticement, through deception, through confusion, through pressure and tribulation, and through all these things, remaining faithful to the truth of God. In verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, then shall the end come. He didn't say the gospel is going to be preached and everybody's going to be converted. He said it'll be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Now, which gospel? This gospel of the kingdom. You know, for centuries there has been a gospel that has been preached. Why, there have been all sorts of churches that sent missionaries to Africa and China and all sorts of places. If they were preaching the gospel, the end should have come a long time ago. Was that what they were doing? The disciples asked Jesus for a sign. Notice back in verse 3, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? They asked Him for a sign, and what's the sign He gave them? This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Then shall the end come. That's going to be the sign of His coming. There's going to be a work that will be done. Then He talked about an abomination of desolation that will occur in the aftermath of that. Talks about His people going to the mountains. He talks about great tribulation in verse 21. Talks about verse 29, great powerful heavenly signs, and then in verse 31, the great sound of a trumpet. There is a progression through as Jesus Christ answers the questions the disciples gave. We're going to come back here a little bit later. We're going to notice some other things. But it is important to understand that Jesus Christ addressed the subject of prophecy. He addressed it very strongly. Jesus Christ came with a message, not simply for His time and His day, but a message that reaches on down to our time and our day. God declares the end from the beginning. He has a great plan and purpose He is working out. And He doesn't just leave us in some sort of vague generality. The Bible is filled with specific prophecies. Jesus did not rebuke the disciples for wanting to know what to look for. He didn't say, "Oh, you don't look for anything." That's not what He told them. He gave them specific signs. He gave them specific information when they asked Him the question. This was His perfect opportunity to tell them that they shouldn't be thinking about such things, that, He wasn't really coming back, or it was a metaphor, or whatever He could have told them. He didn't tell them any of those things. He went through and answered their question in very specific form. Now, we see a crazy world around us. We see unrest and strife going on every continent. We see crime and violence just mushrooming. There's scarcely a major city in this country that you would dare to walk down the streets of late at night. In fact, some of them you don't want to walk down the streets during the daytime. Some streets. And we look at those things, and yes, that's horrible. We look at the rising immorality. We look at all of the problems, and yet we realize that many societies down through, there's a sequence that societies have gone through down through time. They have had a period of growth and development, and they have had a period of decay. That's happened to many societies. What makes us think this time is it? How do we know that? How can you really know or make heads or tails of Bible prophecy? The Bible talks about all sorts of prophetic events. A large part of the Bible is prophecy. Prophecy is important, but how can you really know that you understand anything about prophecy? You can hear all sorts of people who come up with ideas. Why, all you got to do late at night sometimes is just tune your radio. You can catch preachers all up and down the dial. They'll all have some particular interpretation, their thing. This one thinks, and it comes in fads, different things, that is sort of the issue of the moment. I remember back in the 60s, that if you heard somebody, they were, somehow they managed to see a great war with Russia. Russia was the enemy. That was the terrible enemy. And you come on down, some of them come up, a few years ago they decided Saddam Hussein was, he was the beast. That was Babylon. And people come up with all sorts of ideas. And of course the people they pick out come and go. I remember back, a number of years back, there were people that figured Henry Kissinger, he was the man. Somebody came up with the idea that President Reagan, when he was president, that his full name, Ronald Wilson Reagan, 6 letters in each of his 3 names. 666. What did that prove? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. President Reagan is long since out of office, and you can come and go, and you can come up with all sorts of things that people come up with. How can you know? Well, I want to give you, in the closing portion of the sermon, I want to give you some keys that are really a basic starting point in terms of understanding prophecy. Because the world in which we live can make sense, and it can be understood. In Psalm 111, verse 10 is the most important key. It's the starting point. When somebody doesn't have this key, then they're no source of prophetic understanding. Psalm 111, verse 10. The fear of the eternal is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do His commandments. Also, the starting point is to stand in awe and reverence of God. The fear of the eternal is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding of all they that do His commandments. So obedience is the key. That's the starting point. If you don't obey God, if you don't have a yielded, submissive mind to God, if you're not subject to the law of God, and are yielded to God, standing in awe of God, why would you think God would open your mind up to have all this understanding? You know, it's interesting. That was the starting point when God began to work with Mr. Armstrong. First thing that God worked with him on had to do with two things. One was to bring him to a point of really proving the existence of a real God and disproving evolution. And the other thing was to prove whether or not the law of God is in force and effect for us today. You know, his wife had come to understand the Sabbath. He was challenged over the issue of evolution and over the issue of the Sabbath right at the same time. Once he had come to prove that God really does exist, and that God's law is in force and effect, and showed a yielded, submitted, surrendered mind and heart, a willingness to obey God and to walk with God, then God began to open his mind up to understand a lot of other things. But if he hadn't been willing to obey God, he would have never understood the other things. See, that's the starting point. People may understand bits and pieces, but you'll never get the whole picture if you don't start from the premise of really standing in awe and reverence of God. That's why the scholars can't understand the Bible. And they don't. They don't. All you've got to do, you know, there was an article just recently in Newsweek. They had gone around and interviewed a bunch of scholars. You've never seen such a silly mess in your life. Why, our little kids. Our little kids, 6, 7 years old, could give better answers and explanations than what some of these guys did. It was just incredible. You read through there, you know, and just the crazy thing. Oh, but this guy, you know, he's Dr. So-and-so from such and such. He's really smart. Well, they couldn't figure out, even the beginning. Because they really didn't stand in awe and reverence of God. They started wanting to go through the Bible and decide they got together a seminar of these scholars. Now, that's always a good start. So they got together a seminar, and they went through the New Testament, and they decided to vote on what Jesus really said and what he didn't say. So the first thing they did was throw out about 75% of what the New Testament says that Christ said. But these were learned men. They all spoke Greek, you understand. They were scholars. They were from Harvard and Yale and all sorts of seminaries and divinity schools, and they got together and they debated the subject, and they came up with what they knew that Christ didn't say, and some things that he may have said, probably it was a paraphrase. Some things that he did say, and there was very little that he really said. And they came up with various ideas. And those ideas weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Well, you can't understand the Bible if you don't stand in awe of God and if you don't obey Him. That's the starting point. That's the beginning. And that's the first key to understanding Bible prophecy, is a yielded heart and mind, a surrendered heart and mind that is living in awe and reverence of God and in obedience to Him. Now, the next key, which builds right on this, is understanding the plan of salvation revealed by the holy days. That gives you an overview of the whole scheme of prophecy. You can't understand the details if you don't understand the big picture. It's like having a picture, a literal picture. Maybe have a picture like this, but instead of you looking at the picture, let's cover the whole picture, and we'll let you look at one little section. We'll put a magnifying glass down over one little spot, and you can look through the magnifying glass. Now, what are you going to figure out? Well, not a whole lot. First thing you need to do is see the big picture. If you see the big overall picture, then you can start focusing on certain details. There's nothing wrong with studying details, but if you don't understand the big picture, you will never get meaning out of the details. The details will just be confusing to you if you don't have the big picture. And that's what happens, you see, to so many. If you understand God's plan of salvation revealed in the holy days, you understand Pentecost. The name for Pentecost throughout the Old Testament is Feast of First Fruits. You understand that the harvest cycle in ancient Israel was a type of God's spiritual harvest. The spiritual harvest in which God is now engaged. And we're approaching the Feast of First Fruits, Pentecost. And then in the fall, there's the Feast of Tabernacles. But what else is that called? What's it called in the Old Testament? It's called the Feast of Ingathering. So you've got the Feast of First Fruits Harvest in the late spring, and you've got the great Feast of Ingathering in the fall. Now that tells you something. That tells you that in terms of God's spiritual harvest, that God is not in the process of trying to save the whole world right now. If He is, He has really come out far on the worst end. God has been, Ellen G. White many years ago wrote a book called The Great Controversy. And here, there's a great controversy between God and the devil. God's trying to get the whole world saved. And God is desperately trying to get everybody saved, and the devil's trying to get everybody lost. And boy, has the devil come out on top. You can just look around. If you counted everybody that even called themselves a Christian, you'd still have only a tiny fraction of mankind that has ever lived. Is God busily, does this represent the best God can do? Has He been trying His hardest for 2,000 years since Christ came, and He just, this is just the best He can do? Because you have to face, it's not even if you counted everybody that called themselves a Christian, but then when you begin to look at that, how many of them really take it seriously? We call ourselves a Christian nation. People at least acknowledge, they say, well, people all go to church on Sunday. But you just pick a Sunday where there's a major sporting event and find out how many people are watching the sporting event as opposed to how many people went to church that day. Even by the criteria the world uses, they're coming up short. Even by the world standards. And when you really begin to look at it and understand that it's not everyone that says, Lord, Lord, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven, now that's really a tiny fraction. Does that represent the best God can do? No. When you understand the holy days, you understand that God has a plan and a purpose that He is working out. And it's not that everything is somehow going to get better and better. It's somehow that all the churches working together will somehow bring everybody to Christ, and we'll just make this world a better place, and oh, what a wonderful world it'll be. That's not the message that you understand when you look at the holy days, because you realize, well, what does the Feast of Pentecost mean? What does trumpets mean? When Jesus Christ is going to come back in power and glory to establish the government of God. The Feast of Tabernacles. If you understand that, if you look at the Feast of Tabernacles in the last great day, the Seventh-day Adventists have for years taught that the earth will be desolate during the 1,000 years. The earth will be empty. Satan will be chained by circumstances. There won't be anybody here to deceive. Because all the saints will be up in heaven. They'll be carrying out the investigative judgment. Boy, wouldn't that be an exciting way to spend 1,000 years poring over the books, checking up on everything your neighbor has done. You always wondered whether they did it or not. Now you have a chance to really, read the inside story. Be sort of like the National Enquirer for 1,000 years. It doesn't make sense, really, when you think about it. And yet you realize, there are millions of people that have believed things like that. People have all sorts of ideas. But if you understand the plan as laid out in the holy days, you've got a big picture. It makes sense. You see what God is doing as you come from Pentecost and you come to trumpets and Feast of Tabernacles, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, last great day. There is a progression that fits right in and makes clear. You get a big picture. And that's vital if you're going to understand the Bible. If you're going to understand Bible prophecy, you've got to start with an overview. Understanding the plan and purpose God is working out. Then we know where things are headed, and we know the basic breakdown of how these things work out. Now let's begin to get more specific. If you start going through the prophecies of the Old Testament, remember much of the Psalms is prophecy. In fact, much of the books that people don't even think about are prophecy. Really are. We just got through reading some prophecies out of the Psalms. But whether you go to the Psalms, whether you go to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, whether you go to the minor prophets, to Hosea, and Joel, and Amos, and Obadiah, and Jonah, and Micah, and Nahum, all through, time after time after time, what is mentioned more, what nation, what name is mentioned more than any other place? Israel. When you read the prophecies over and over again, they're talking about Israel. You read it in Isaiah, you read it in Jeremiah, you read it in Ezekiel, you read it in Hosea, over and over again, keep talking about Israel. Now, brethren, if you don't know who Israel is, if you don't know where Israel is, those prophecies make no sense. Have you ever walked up when somebody's engaged in a conversation and they're talking, and you don't know who they're talking about? How much sense do you get out of the conversation? Most of us have, somebody's talking, you sort of walk up, and you listen for a little bit, and you can't figure it out because you don't know who they're talking about. Maybe they're talking about you, But you don't know who they're talking about. You can't get anything out of the conversation if you don't know who they're talking about. You can't get anything out of the prophecies, or very, very little other than just sort of vague generalities. If God didn't want us to understand, would He have spent all this time? Do we have some who are smarter than God? They can go through and just eliminate whole sections of the Bible because we don't need those anymore. You see some, I remember when I was a little kid in the Baptist church, they used to pass out New Testaments. And they gave us the New Testament with Psalms and Proverbs. A lot of you have seen those, the little New Testament. That eliminated everything you didn't need. Didn't need the law. Didn't need the prophets. You had all that in there, but you really didn't need to even worry about Revelation because nobody could understand that. So they might as well have taken it out. Well, God didn't give us a lot of superfluous material in the Bible. He didn't just fill it up with space that we could just go through and sort of rip all those pages out. So you can't understand those things. So let's just look at a little of it. Ezekiel. Let's go to Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 3. In Ezekiel 3, and verse 4, he said unto me, Son of man, go get you unto the house of Israel, and speak my words unto them. Coming on down to verse 17, Son of man, I have made you a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word of my mouth, and give them warning from me. Now Ezekiel was writing this about 125 years after the house of Israel had gone into captivity. Because remember, when King Solomon died, the kingdom split. And the northern 10 tribes, the northern tribes, Israel, chose a king of their own, and the southern tribe of Judah, allied with Benjamin, remained faithful to the house of David. And their histories come on down through Kings. You can read also the parallel in Chronicles, but particularly in the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, the histories of Israel and Judah come down parallel, and then you see where Israel went into Assyrian captivity. So Ezekiel is coming along writing. You can go to Ezekiel 1. I won't go through the details of it, but you can go there and date it clearly because it dates itself. So it says when this occurred. That this was about 125 years after Israel was in captivity. And here is Ezekiel writing a warning to the house of Israel. That wasn't for the house of Israel in his day. Was he just, was God running late? Maybe God didn't know the difference between history and prophecy? No, that's ridiculous. But how are you going to go to the house of Israel if you don't know where the house of Israel is? You can't. You can't fulfill that. You can't be a watchman to the house of Israel if you don't know who the house of Israel is. On down in chapter 12. Chapter 12 and verse 6. Latter part of the verse, he says, I have sent you for a sign unto the house of Israel. On down in verse 9, Son of man, has not the house of Israel, the rebellious house, said unto me, what do you do? On down in verse 11, say, I am your sign, like as I have done, so shall it be done unto them. They shall remove and go into captivity. That is a prophecy. They shall remove. It is a prophecy. It is something for the future, for the house of Israel. But that's meaningless to you if you don't know who Israel is. Well, there are all sorts of people who, every time they read, hear about Israel, they think of the little nation over in the Middle East. Well, that's going to give you a totally different view of prophecy if that's if that's what you think, if that's all that the house of Israel is. Amos chapter 4. Amos chapter 4. In verse 6 he says, I also have given you cleanness of teeth in all their cities and want of bread in your places. Verse 7, I've withholden rain from you. There were yet 3 months of the harvest. I caused it to rain upon one city, caused it not to rain upon another city. Now there are those that seemingly don't think that all the upset weather conditions have anything to do with God. Does God have anything to do with the weather? Well, He says, I have withheld rain, caused it to rain in one city and not to rain in another. In fact, He says in verse 9, I've smitten you with blasting and mildew. Boy, that goes the opposite direction. Sometimes it's so wet that everything mildews. All the crops are ruined that way. Sometimes it gets so hot and dry and there's no water and it just all withers up and that hot wind just blasts away. It just dries it all up. So various diseases, the diseases of Egypt. Young men dying in warfare, verse 10. Verse 12, therefore thus will, so future tense, thus will I do unto you, O Israel, and because I will do this unto you, prepare to meet your God, O Israel. So here is a prophecy for the future, and it relates to a nation called Israel. Where are these things going to happen? Where are these catastrophes spoken of here going to happen? You know, you can read back in the book of Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 7, it talks about a time. It says, alas, that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble. He'll be saved out of it. The time of Jacob's trouble. Where are the people of Jacob? Where are the people of Israel? We're told that a time of trouble is going to happen. The worst time that has ever been. Jesus talked about back in Matthew 24, a time of tribulation so great that there has never been one like it. So when you look at the news and you see all of the butchery going on, whether it's in Africa or the Balkans or wherever, according to your Bible, this book right here in your lap, according to your Bible, there is coming a time of tribulation, a time of trial, a time of adversity and calamity on a nation by the name of Israel that will pale into insignificance everything that has come before. It's pretty important to know where that nation is. Where is Israel? Where do we find Israel? Some people think it's just the Jews, but you know, God talks about Judah. He talks about that separately in Zechariah 12. Zechariah 12:2, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Well, you can go back and you can read about what happened in 1948. In the United Nations troops, that's all nations, you know. You can go back and read what happened. You can read that everyone that got tangled up with it, what happened to them. In verse 5, or verse 6, in that day will I make the governors of Judah like a hearth of fire among the wood, and like a torch of fire in a sheaf, and they'll devour all the people round about. You remember the 6-Day War, 1967? I do. I have very vivid memories of where I was. I'd read Mr. Armstrong's co-worker letter just a few days before. And he was on his way to Jerusalem. He had just signed a contract with King Hussein of Jordan to begin broadcasting on Radio Jerusalem. We're all excited about that. He was actually in transit by car from the campus in Brickett Wood down to the airport to fly over to Jordan, fly to Jerusalem, because remember, Jerusalem was in Jordanian hands at that time. He was ready to leave that Pentecost weekend, or just prior to the weekend, ready to go down there that Sunday. And I remember where I was that Sunday morning. I was in a car on the way from Taylor, Louisiana down to Baton Rouge. And boy, did I perk up in a hurry. I was sort of dozy. It was early in the morning. We were leaving on our way to Baton Rouge. And I perked up in a real big hurry when I heard about that war, because I had just gotten through reading the coworker letter. And I knew something was going on. And in 6 days, the governors of Judah were like fire, like a torch of fire in a sheath. And they devoured all the people round about. Incredible what happened. All of the nations round about, these things happen. Well, God talks about Judah. There are prophecies about Judah, the fact that Judah would be regathered and would be there in Jerusalem. In fact, it talks about in Zechariah 14, behold, the day of the Lord comes. In verse 2, I'll gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth, fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. Jesus Christ is coming back in power and in glory. There are events to happen in Judah and in Jerusalem. The Bible talks about that, but it also talks about Israel. It talks about the house of Israel. And it makes a very clear distinction. For instance, in Jeremiah 32:32, it says, because of all the evil of the children of Israel and of the children of Judah. Up in verse 30 of Jeremiah 32, for the children of Israel and the children of Judah have only done evil before me. Well, you can go place after place and find that God makes a clear distinction between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. You can't understand Bible prophecy if you don't understand the identity of Israel, because you don't know to whom all these prophecies apply. That's one of the most vital keys as you begin to zoom in from the great overview, big picture, master plan. We begin to get down to specifics. The Bible is filled with specific prophecies about Israel. So it's pretty important to identify modern Israel. Where is the Israel of Bible prophecy? Where is the house of Israel today? The next thing that is vital to understand, and is a very important key, is to understand who is the beast of the book of Revelation. Now, a lot of people get confused. They focus in, and you can hear all sorts of things, because that's the key to understanding. When you understand the beast of Revelation, then the woman that rides the beast in Revelation 17, that's clear. The mark of the beast becomes, you can't understand the mark of the beast if you don't know who the beast is. How can you understand the mark if you don't even know whose mark it is? People come up with all sorts of crazy ideas, Like I say, or 666. People come up with every sort of thing imaginable. Somebody came up with Ronald Reagan's name. What does that have to do with the beast? Nothing. No, maybe your name adds up to 666. I don't know. What would that prove? Nothing. You've got to start with letting the Bible interpret itself. People come up with all sorts of crackpot ideas. Some decided way back that Social Security numbers, that must be the mark of the beast. Credit cards, that's it. They're the scan on the electronic scans. That's the mark. What do they do? It's sort of like throwing darts at a board. They pick a detail and jump to a conclusion. And where do you get that way? You don't get anywhere you want to be. You can't. That's not the way you understand truth. You understand it in a systematic way. You want to understand the book of Revelation? Start back in Daniel. You can't understand Revelation without Daniel. You start with Daniel because Revelation uses the same symbols Daniel used, and Daniel records the biblical interpretation. People read a detail here or there, and then they start letting their imagination run wild and speculate. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's the New Age. Maybe it's devil worshippers. Or maybe it's this. Maybe it's that. Let the Bible interpret the Bible. If you want to understand Revelation, go back to Daniel. Start right there. Daniel 2, Daniel 1 gives the the sort of the historic background of the book. Tells you a little bit about Daniel and how he came to be in Babylon. And then when you get to Daniel chapter 2, you find that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And Daniel gave God's interpretation of the dream. Daniel didn't say, well, I think, and I consulted with this scholar and this other fellow over here, and I looked over there, and Dr. So-and-so thinks this, and, we sort of got together and figured maybe you ate too much garlic the night before. No. Daniel said, there is a God in heaven who makes known unto the king the things that shall come to pass hereafter. Oh, there's a God in heaven that reveals secrets. And so Daniel then went through. I'm paraphrasing. You go through and read it in Daniel too. For the sake of time, we will make this we start going through every detail. We'll make this no telling how many parts. So I'm going to summarize. But I'll give you the scripture reference. You go back and check it out. You prove it out. Am I preaching what it says? Well, you go back and look it up. It's there. Daniel 2. What does he say? Well, he saw this huge image and had a head of gold, shoulders of silver, thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet, 10 toes, comprised of a mixture of iron and miry clay. Then he saw this stone of supernatural origin, a stone cut out without hands, that came down and smashed the image on its toes. And the whole image turned to dust and blew away. And the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, is that where Daniel 2 ends? No. Daniel then gave God's interpretation. He said, you, O king, are a king of kings. You are this head of gold. The Babylonian empire over which you rule, that's the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to you. And all you got to do is just go through a little further in the book of Daniel, and you'll read where this other kingdom arose. The kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. You can read right in the book of Daniel about the fall of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, killed that very night of the Feast of Trumpets in 539 BC when the Persian troops poured into Babylon. He said, you're the head of gold, the Babylonian Empire, and then there will arise another kingdom, identified clearly in the book of Daniel as Persia. And then there would arise a third kingdom, the kingdom of brass. And Persia, of course, was swallowed up by Alexander the Great's Greek Empire. And then what happened to Alexander's empire? Well, all of the various portions of it were eventually swallowed up by Rome. The great Roman Empire, the great empire of iron, the empire that has continued on down through its various successors, coming all the way down to what Daniel 2 clearly shows are 10 nations, 10 kings that will be destroyed. Their government, their empire over which they rule, will be destroyed when Jesus Christ returns. We're told in Daniel 2 that means the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. So you've got an outline, a succession of world-ruling empires from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome. Now you come on back to Daniel 7 and you find Daniel describes the same thing, but here he sees it with different imagery. He sees a great creature coming up out of the sea. He sees this creature like a lion, and then he sees a bear, and then he sees a leopard with 4 heads, and then he sees a 4th terrible creature, different from all the others, with teeth of iron. And it subdues and tramples everything. And you come all the way down, and again, you come down to the culmination when that kingdom, it has, the 10 horns. First, a little horn that pops up, before whom the first 3 are plucked out. And then you have these final 7 horns, and then you finally come on down to the fact that the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom. Again, it is a tracing of world events right down to the time when Jesus Christ returns in power and glory. Now, you go back to Revelation, in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, you read about this system called Babylon the Great, because it started in Babylon, and it is a continuation of the Babylonish system. And you read of the creature with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The focus, as we come on down in the book of Revelation, on the Roman Empire. Because after all, Babylon and Persia and Greece had already ceased by the time John wrote Revelation. The Roman Empire was on the world scene, and John focused in on the latter details. And he describes these resurrections of the Roman Empire. And he describes a woman under the guise of a great fallen church. A fallen woman, a great whore, who's the mother of harlots and abominations. And she's riding this beast. Now, sometimes the creature proved rather frisky, and all she could do was sort of hold on for the ride. And sometimes she was very effective at controlling where the creature went. Any of you who've ever done much riding knows that, you can experience both. And that, of course, has been the history of Rome and the church. You read of that system there in Revelation. Then when we start looking for the mark of the beast and we look at these things, we're looking of things that are the brand and the insignia of Rome. Because that is the 4th of the empires, the 4th of the creatures, the one that was existent at the time John was writing, and the one in which he goes into the most detail in the book of Revelation. And I don't have time in this afternoon sermon to go through all the heads and the horns. I've done that in sermons and Bible studies in the past. Probably the tapes are available. We've got it in print. I'm sure I'll go through it again. But there is an overview, a clear succession of kingdoms and empires. We can know where we stand in the flow of events, because there are to be 7 revivals of the Roman Empire. After the deadly wound was healed, the beast received a deadly wound was healed, and there's 7 revivals. Well, that's a matter of history. The Roman Empire fell in 476. There was an imperial restoration by Justinian in 554. That was the healing. That was the first revival. The second was under Charlemagne in 800. The third was under Otto in the 10th century, 962. The fourth was under the Habsburgs in the Middle Ages. And the fifth was under Napoleon. The 6th revival occurred in the lifetime of several of you, a number of you sitting right here, during the time when Mussolini finally declared a revival of the Roman Empire, entered into the Rome-Berlin axis. That revival, once again, an attempt finally to put back together the old Roman Empire once again. 6 have come and gone, and one final one is yet to occur. When you look at where these things are centered, then you realize that whatever part Saddam Hussein has to play, it has nothing whatsoever to do with the beast of Revelation. Just as simple as that. You can't go through Daniel and Revelation and put together all the progression and come up with the beast being somebody down, an arrow. You're looking at a revival of the old Holy Roman Empire. Now, I grant the Bible does talk about Arab powers. It talks about the king of the south who was going to contest the king of the north. There are other areas for some of these other people to fit, but understanding this makes sense of it. When you read that and you realize which ones are going to have a part to play, and you look down through time, you see this period. You see this system that is described. It makes sense out of these things. And we can then understand things like the mark of the beast, which is a mark or a brand of disobedience to God. Why does God care whether you use paper checks or paper money or plastic cards or pieces of metal in your pocket? Why is one inherently more righteous than the other? It makes no sense. But you understand that there is a sign of obedience between God and His people, and there is a brand of disobedience that identifies someone as part and parcel of old pagan Roman sun worship. It goes all the way back to Babylon. Then you have something that is a clear point of division. So that's an important key to understanding Bible prophecy. Understanding this sequence. Understanding who is the beast of the book of Revelation. A fifth key to understanding prophecy is simply understanding the sequence of events that's laid out in Revelation 6 and Matthew 24. You know, in Revelation 6, the seals are open. And the first seal is a white horse. And the second seal is a red horse. The warfare that goes forth. And the third seal is the black horse of famine, and the pale horse then of death or disease. The fourth seal. The fifth seal, when you go through Revelation 6, it talks about a time of martyrdom, a time of future martyrdom, of tribulation. The sixth seal, and you've got dramatic heavenly signs that occur. And then when you get on down, the seventh seal is open, and there's seven trumpets that culminate in the final seventh trumpet in the return of Jesus Christ in power and glory. Well, Jesus Christ interpreted this in Matthew 24. He goes that many will come in my name saying, I'm Christ, that there will be wars, that there will be famines, there will be diseases and pestilence. And on down in verse 9 and 10 of Matthew 24, he talks about the people of God being delivered up to persecution. He talks about in verse 29, right after the tribulation, there will be great heavenly signs. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. And on down in verse 30 of Matthew 24, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man. Verse 31, He will send His angels with a great sound of a trumpet. When you put Matthew 24 together with Revelation 6, you have a clear sequence of events that enables us to understand a little bit of an overview as to how some of these things will come about. Another area that we can look, we're going to have to speed up here on the keys. The sixth key has to do with understanding the identity of the Gentile nations as they're identified in prophecy. Now, they're not nearly as many prophecies relating to them as there are to Israel, but several of the Gentile nations are identified by name in Bible prophecy. It talks about Assyria, the rod of my anger. Well, if you're going to be able to understand some of these specific prophecies in the Old Testament, it's needful to go through and to understand who are the descendants of those ancient peoples today. Because they're identified in the pages of your Bible. They're identified in Bible prophecy with specific events that are going to occur. And there's a final key that we will take note of. Let's go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. This is our final key that we will take note of today. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 9. The thing that has been is that which shall be. That which is done is that which shall be done. There is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been of old time, which was before us. You see, there is duality. There's duality in prophecy. History and prophecy are the same thing, seen from different directions. Most of what we study is prophecy today. In the schoolrooms of the world tomorrow, those things will be history, won't they? We look at certain prophecies that were written as prophecies, and they're history to us. You look at all the things that prophesied of the first coming of Christ, all the things that prophesied of His first coming, those things are history to us. When they were written, originally they were prophecy. The events surrounding the things that are happening on the world scene will culminate in the return of Jesus Christ and the establishment of the government of God. In a matter of a few years, those things will be history. So we can look at history and understand many things. The Bible draws many examples of duality. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, in verse 11, we're told, now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Now, if you look up this word example, in my Bible, there's a little one out by the word example, and in the margin it says, or types. Because if you'll check it up in a concordance or a lexicon, you'll find that the word for examples here is a Greek word, tupio. It's the word we get our word type from. It would be spelled out in English, T-Y-P-I-O. It's the word we get our English word type from. It means a pattern. So, the things that happened here, speaking of ancient Israel, happened as a pattern, as a type. Over and over in the Bible, we find that there is a duality. Jesus Christ in Matthew 24 referred to the abomination of desolation, the one spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And when you go back and you read it, in Daniel you read that there was a historical sequence and there was a historical fulfillment. And that is an example. It is a type. It is a pattern of an event yet future associated with the second coming of Christ. So the Bible is filled with patterns or with examples or with types. There is a duality. Now, I want to give you a key of caution on this. I want to give you a point of caution on the seventh key. I've really gone, if you look at these keys, I feel that I've pretty well gone through them in the order of their importance. You know what sometimes people want to do is start with the seventh, which can lead into all sorts of speculation and sort of make themselves look foolish and ridiculous in the long run. If you start from the first one, which has to do with obeying God. You know, I don't care if you understand all prophecy and all doctrine, have all knowledge, if you're not acting on it and living it, what good is that going to do? You'll just have the distinction of being the smartest person to go into the lake of fire. You know, that'd be quite a distinction, wouldn't it? Well, this is the smartest guy to go in there. He knew everything. Just didn't do anything, but he knew it all. Well, I don't think any of us want that distinction. So, you know, it starts out with a yielded, submissive, obedient heart and mind. Really walking with God. Having an overview of God's great plan of salvation so you know, you have the big picture, you know where we're going, and you understand this is not the only day of salvation. There is a pattern that is being worked out, and there are the great time of the great harvest is yet future. It's outlined in the holy days. Then you begin to move into specifics. We understand where Israel is, so we understand then all of these prophecies of the Old Testament, we understand to whom they have reference. As you come on down, you understand about the beast of Daniel and Revelation. Then you have a sequence in terms of the Gentile nations and the system that is arising in Europe. And you understand Europe is the place that will have to arise. That it is a revival, the final revival of the old Holy Roman Empire. Well, that sort of limits where it can be and who it can be, doesn't it? That pretty well identifies all the major players when you understand that. Then when you understand the sequence of events is laid out in Revelation 6 and Matthew 24, you understand, the identity of certain of the Gentile nations, Moab and Ammon and Assyria, and some are real easy. When it talks about Egypt, that's pretty easy to guess. Some of the others are not, are fairly clearly identified historically. But that's really you getting into a little more minor area of prophecy in the sense that you've already got a pretty good overview by the time you get there. And then when you come down to duality, to examples and patterns, realize there are things for examples and patterns, but sometimes this can get into somewhat of a speculative area, because exactly how each pattern is going to be fulfilled is not always real clear. Some things are very clear, and the fact that God uses patterns, the patterns are there not so we can do all sorts of elaborate guesswork, but so we can understand and find certain things recognizable. He tells us, for instance, in Matthew, or in Malachi, the end of Malachi, that before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, I will send you Elijah the prophet. So we know that Elijah was the example. He was the pattern. Then when you come into the New Testament, we find that John the Baptist fulfilled that pattern. And Malachi makes it plain that before the second coming of Christ, that pattern would also be fulfilled. So then you go back, and by the time you look at Elijah, the time you look at John the Baptist, you have some understanding of what to look for in the end time of one who would come in the spirit and power of Elijah, who would restore knowledge, who would make ready a people prepared for their God, who would restore the knowledge of the true religion in Israel. These patterns, these types, these examples become clearer. Again, this final key is one that we have to be careful with, in the sense that people can just start going through and guessing, but there are patterns that are clearly established. There is a duality to prophecy. And as you go through and get the overview, you've got to work from the big, broad picture down to the specifics. If you start with the details, you'll just have confusion. If you start with the big picture and work down, the details fit into their logical place. You know, if you set out to put a jigsaw puzzle together, and you never saw the picture as to what you're supposed to wind up with, you'd have trouble. Can you imagine? You don't know what it's supposed to look like. You just start trying to fit pieces together. Well, no telling what kind of confusion and how long it'll take. Sometimes it's hard enough when you've seen the big picture. But if you don't know what the big picture is, to try and fit it all together is very difficult. So you start out with a big picture and work our way down. And that is important. The Bible talks quite a bit about prophecy. A great deal of the pages of this book consists of prophecy. Tomorrow's news today. Jesus Christ came talking about prophecy. In fact, we're told in the book of Revelation, in chapter 19 and verse 10, John says that I fell at the feet of this angel to worship him. And he said unto me, see that you do it not, for I am your fellow servant, and of your brethren that have the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. What does the gospel of Jesus Christ have to do with prophecy? A great deal. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Jesus Christ bore testimony of those things which give life to all of the prophecies of the Scripture. He's the one that makes them come alive. That's why we call Matthew 24 the focal point of Bible prophecy. Because the real pivot point in history is the return of Jesus Christ to this earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, when the government of God is restored to this world and God finally sets His hand to save all of humanity. Very important to understand the great plan and purpose that God is working out here below. We should be very thankful and appreciative of the insight that God gives us and the fact that He reveals these things. We don't have to live just in a world of doubt and a world surrounded by every sort of thing. We can know and understand because God has declared the end from the beginning.